So I'm going to do something a little bit different here on my channel today. It's been a while since I posted any long form content, and this subject has been brewing in my mind for a hot minute. I actually seem to get more interest with short form content, but if you guys are into it, I will post more stuff like this, but only if it turns out to be of value to you. Long form video essays are quite a bit more time consuming to make, so if you like it, then click like, subscribe, comment, and all that stuff, because it's the only way I know that it is of value to you. Trust me, I ain't doing this for the money. I still have yet to earn one thin dime from this YouTube stuff. So, I mean, it's a good thing I actually have a day job. I am a medical director, psychiatrist at a busy medical outpatient practice, as well as an inpatient substance use rehab center. But, of course, that doesn't mean that I am qualified to comment on the nature of fantasy or science fiction. What does qualify me in that area is, in my not so humble opinion, is my academic background. I don't get into it in depth here often, but I have been writing for most of my career on such topics as, obviously, analytical psychology or Jungian psychology, mythology, dream interpretation, anthropology, spirituality and mental health, and the neuroscience, code biology, and genetics of the imagination, and even the philosophy of mind and the self. And when I say I've been writing on these subjects, I mean I've been publishing them in peer-reviewed journals. So just so you know, I'm very serious about this stuff, and not just some internet rando. Okay, well, not only some internet rando. But all of these topics that I have published on play into the understanding of science fiction, as I'm about to hopefully explain to you. So let's get into it. What is science fiction anyway? At the first order of business is, what do I mean by the term science fiction? How does it relate to fantasy and the psyche? That's two questions. So let's tackle the second question first. In this, I think this is the easier of the two, and I pretty much agree with Ursula Le Guin and Terry Pratchett and other folks that say that science fiction is essentially a subgenre of fantasy and grew out of it. In other words, all science fiction is specialized fantasy, but not all fantasy is science fiction. That's the easy question. The hard question is, what is science fiction? And the question of when the earliest science fiction story was written down is actually debatable. Of course, opinions vary on that. And the claim that it is very old is one side of it. And on the other side of it is that it is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, say in the last 200 years or so. And this is because there are ancient stories of flying machines that can go to the stars and planets, characters traveling through time or in vessels that can go underwater, people using weapons that can destroy entire cities. Stories with those kinds of elements go as far back as the Rig Veda, which dates to the 2nd millennium BCE. And even in the oral mythologies of indigenous people, sometimes you can find stories of characters going to the moon and meeting gods there and other characters. So the argument goes that these stories might qualify as sci-fi, even though they don't refer to any sort of technology that even remotely existed at the time. But you can see how it would be quite difficult to differentiate that kind of story from just a straight-up fantasy. Others examples from world folklore. Folktale type 471A, called The Monk and the Bird, by folklorists anyway, for example, has a character who listens to a bird singing, but then comes back home to realize 300 years have passed. So in a way, it's kind of a time travel story. This story has been documented by folklorists ranging from Mexico to Russia to China. Tale 304, The Dangerous Night Watch, has a character who stops time. And in this story, you can find in the folklore of people ranging from Europe to Africa to Mongolia. But do these features really differentiate fantasy from science fiction? Quite a few art critics and historians don't really think so. Rather, the other side of this debate argues that even though these stories somewhat resemble science fiction, they might be more honestly described as proto-science fiction. This side of the argument claims that sci-fi didn't really come into its own as a fully identifiable subgenre until around the 18th or 19th centuries, and mainly only in westernized contexts. This time period is, of course, the so-called Age of Reason, which saw an explosion of stories about going to the moon, having mad scientists, and so forth. Obviously, it's impossible to have mad scientists if there aren't any actual scientists around to create the trope. But all of this seemed to culminate in around the early 19th century with a single author, Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, it is argued, began the science fiction genre in earnest with her masterpiece, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. This story, of course, contains mad scientists, experiments gone awry, and various other proto-sci-fi elements, and weaves them together seamlessly, along with some deep philosophical meditations on the ramifications of the technology devised by the title character. English writer, editor, and artist Brian Aldiss credits Frankenstein as the seminal work to which sci-fi label can be logically attached. I agree. But maybe for not the reasons that Aldiss invokes. I think Frankenstein is an identifiable point at which we can see a transition from proto-sci-fi to full sci-fi, but not because it aggregates mad scientists, and mad science, and so forth into a ripping good yarn. Rather, I identify Frankenstein as the starting point because it has one key ingredient that had been missing up to that point in the proto-sci-fi stories. This thematic element has been elaborated on endlessly since Frankenstein, so much so that I would argue that it is possibly the most important element that defines sci-fi, even if some sci-fi only deals with it tangentially. So, what is this key missing ingredient, you ask? Well, it's really a thematic question more so than an ingredient, per se. It's a question that the sci-fi novel poses, in my opinion, and usually answers to one degree or another. Like all well-written stories, a well-written sci-fi will be a narrative of images and symbols that deals with often many key questions and themes without necessarily explicitly stating them, of course. What identifies a general story like that as a sci-fi, I argue, is that it deals with the particular theme I will reveal in a moment, often and in great depth. Now, what do I mean with deal with a particular question in depth? Let's use a non-science fiction example first so that you can see what I mean. Let's take one of my favorites, Lord of the Rings. This story poses a question. What is the nature of evil, and what can be done about it? This is a very, very important question to Tolkien. Tolkien argues his answer to those questions through the actions of the characters. Now, why do that? Well, because if it was super easy to just simply state the answer, then you wouldn't need a long, complicated story to provide it. Nevertheless, Tolkien does answer the question he poses, and in great depth. And I've done other videos on this subject, which I will link in the description, where I get into exactly how he did that and what his answers and what the questions was. In any case, a well-written story will pose a thematic question and will answer it using the images, characters, actions, and metaphors of the story. This is a very powerful thing to do, and it can last generations. Why? Because it speaks not just to the intellect, but because it uses characters, images, it touches our emotions, it deals with our empathy, our feeling, and images based on the body. In other words, a powerful story of any genre will speak to the entire being. Moreover, good stories are not just ones that explored any old question. No. Good stories are ones that tackle emotionally resonant themes. Stories that don't do this aren't necessarily bad, of course. They can still be a lot of fun. They can be romps where the good guys fight the bad guys and the good guys win. Spider-Man saves MJ from the Green Goblin. Superman defeats Lex Luthor. That kind of stuff. These stories are fun, and I don't mean to be a snob about them at all, but unless they tackle relevant questions, they will be relatively forgettable, and they won't stand the test of time the way folktales or works like Frankenstein have, or Lord of the Rings for that matter. Archetypal images are the bricks and mortar that are used in the construction of these stories. And by archetypal, I mean universally understandable on a visceral level. Things like light and dark, hot and cold, etc. as symbols are universal and potent because they use our common inheritance and our human body even to provide the emotional punch. That would probably be another subject for a nice long form video, I suppose. But anyway, and let me know if you want to see that. So all of this stuff brings me back to the central and maybe even necessary question that science fiction addresses. This central question is very clearly present in Frankenstein, and it has been mutated, elaborated, and expanded on ever since. So what is it? Let me ask you this. Let me list off some of the greatest sci-fi stories and see if you can tell me what the common thematic element they are. You've got 2001, Solaris, Blade Runner, Neuromancer, Stalker, the Foundation series, I, Robot, Alien, Dune, Brave New World, 1984, A Clockwork Orange, The Left Hand of Darkness. Now, it is true that these stories explore a lot of things, but there is a common element in all of them at their core, which I think was perhaps first asked in its modern form in Frankenstein. Now, this question is very simply, what does it mean to be human? At its heart, science fiction asks this question, among others. And I don't mean to imply that this is the only question sci-fi explores. Obviously, that's not true. Just look at the everything but the kitchen sink list of themes that you find in Dune. But even there, particularly in the sequels, the Frankenstein question is strongly present. And another caveat here, I'm not saying that the Frankenstein question was never broached by fantasy. Of course, it had been, largely in relation to not only some of the proto-sci-fi stories I mentioned earlier, but particularly the time travel ones, but also in the age-old struggle with mortality. The theme of death is an essential element to our humanity, and that has been explored for thousands of years in folk tales and myths. A great example would be the Gilgamesh epic, where the hero Gilgamesh seeks the key to immortality. Science fiction, however, takes these ancient themes and questions and zeroes in on a few of them in very tight focus and in an explosion of variations. In Frankenstein, for example, it was, if we could assemble a human from parts, would it have a soul? Would it be deserving of love? Would it know God? These are questions about the essence of humanity. What is that essence? What is non-essential to the human condition? In 2001, for example, we have the central question repeated, this Frankenstein question repeated 3 different ways in each act, each time with a new wrinkle, linked to the tools that we use. In the first act, the question is our human nature related to tool use? In the second act, it's, are those tools going to kill us? And if so, what does that speak to our human condition? And then, of course, in the final act, where the main character becomes the star child, it opens up a whole new question of, well, what does humanity even mean if we evolve into something totally different? Brave New World, Clockwork Orange, and 1984 all explore the relationship of cultural technologies to this question, implicitly arguing that robbing one's freedom by way of various cultural maneuvers is tantamount to undermining our very humanity. The latest story in the Alien franchise, Alien Earth, has no fewer than 4 different versions of the Frankenstein question being explored. We have not only androids, which inherently do this, but cyborgs. And then there's these things called hybrids, in which a human adolescent is transferred, their consciousness is transferred into an android body. What does it mean to be human when these things are possible? And then, of course, you have the xenomorphs themselves, which explore the relationship of other biotechnology organisms into this concept of humanity. As you know, if you're a fan of the Alien franchise, the xenomorph invades the human organism and becomes something altogether different through the process of transformation. And all of these questions are in service to how this stuff relates to the age-old fantasy question, of course, what is the nature of death? Now, horror is, of course, another subgenre of fantasy, which I'll have to get into in a different video. Nevertheless, what I am proposing is that the essential ingredient that often differentiates sci-fi from fantasy is the depth and detail in which it tackles the Frankenstein question. But then, why did it emerge when it did? What is so special about 1818? Moreover, why does the Frankenstein question keep coming up now in new and even more elaborate iterations? Why do we keep revisiting it? This, I think, is where things get really interesting. So, Jungians, such as myself, we've recognized for a long time that some popular stories strike a nerve. And not just ones that make a lot of money, mind you, but ones which stir up the emotions of a particular generation, or even last across generations. And by strike a nerve, I mean they get at the heart of something that stirs up a primordial response. Something that is on a lot of people's minds, even if only unconsciously at first. And this is, of course, the way archetypes work. Now, if you don't know what an archetype is, it's an internal story form response to a particular situation. When faced with becoming an adult, for example, something all humans have faced since the dawn of humanity, very commonly, we will see initiation dreams emerge, or dream narratives involving rebirth, renewal, transformation in caves, the hero's journey, all of that kind of stuff. These story forms are encoded into our human inheritance. It's a big part of my scholarly work that demonstrates that. They are innate, just like, say, the diving reflex. If we dive, the water in our face triggers an innate cascade of responses that shifts our physiology in such a way that we conserve oxygen more efficiently. You could go your entire life and never know you had this capability. It's in the genome, waiting to be activated by the proper conditions. This is how archetypes work, only instead of a physiological response, it's a psychological response. Now, let's keep in mind there's no real division between mind and body. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, when faced with a powerfully emotional situation, we will respond with images and stories that try to make sense of them. Often they will have an innate structure to them. Evolution has deposited them there because we have a multi-million year primate inheritance that sets it up beforehand. In terms of modern storytelling, the most powerful and clearly articulated story responses to life will survive retellings and emerge as a cultural expression with tremendous staying power. The Beauty and the Beast story and the Frog Princess story, for examples, are such responses to the terrifying challenge we all face in our innate drives to find a lover or a mate. This is why these stories are thousands of years old and they're found in every culture studied. But what are all these science fiction stories that tackle the Frankenstein question, along with other things that are also found in fantasy, responding to? Why did the early 19th century call for a honing of the Frankenstein question into its more recent iterations? I think there are two main historical developments that are responsible for the science fiction response. And these two developments are long-term shifts in culture that have in themselves triggered the emotionally poignant and almost desperate archetypal response that's behind this most enduring sci-fi theme. At the center of which all of the sci-fi themes that I'm talking about is this Frankenstein question. Okay, so we often think of technological developments as simply infinite progress. Nothing but an endless parade of otherwise innocuous gizmos being flung out by the capitalist super system that we have now. But the unconscious mind never takes anything for granted. And simple things like growing scientific understanding in multiple fields that was happening rapidly, even back in Mary Shelley's day, did not go unnoticed by the storytelling impulses of her time. As soon as there were scientists, in other words, our unconscious minds, which have a universal core, mind you, recognized that there could be mad scientists. Science was really getting rolling in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it's easy to underestimate just how world-shaking this really was. Before the developments of biology, geology, mathematics, physics, the world was largely explained in literal biblicalist terms. The findings of the 18th century science, however, undermined this simple worldview very thoroughly. And this demanded a response from the storytelling psyche. And it is the inklings of this innate process that we all have that I think resulted in the explosion of science fiction, and it hasn't stopped ever since. Technology, in other words, triggered a powerful activation and a tremendous elaboration of the Frankenstein question. This means that while all fantasy itself, in the form of myths, folklore, and religious imagery, that have always dealt with the deepest and most universal and timeless issues, now had a whole host of new scientific worldviews and technology that had the ability to screw around with this stuff previously we had no ability to change. This meant a significant chunk of fantasy had all kinds of new toys to play with. Mary Shelley being the artistic genius that she was. As an aside, did you know she was 18 when she wrote Frankenstein? Bruh. Anyway, the Frankenstein happened to be the vessel of one of the earliest expressions to tackle the central theme, which was emerging. The emergence of new technology, in other words, was likely seen consciously as great and wonderful, but to the unconscious core self that we all share, it was a full frontal assault on what it means to be human that demanded a meaning-making response to try to grasp its full significance. Thus, the old fantasy question of what is the nature of human life became, what is the nature of human life now that all this crap has been discovered? And this process has not stopped since. Artificial intelligence has been very triggering for this. So has space travel, the very real possibility of alien life. The emergence of these technologies caused a stirring within the universal storytelling inheritance that we all have, and it manifested in artistically gifted individuals as resonant stories that really encapsulate the Frankenstein question and all of its corollary themes. What does it truly mean to be human, given that technology XYZ now exists? It's really easy to see how desperately important this question is in these stories. They're depicted as life or death, existence and annihilation. When Roy Batty gives his famous Tears and Rain speech at the end of Blade Runner, it became iconic because it was something universally human that we could all relate to, except that it was spoken by an artificial human. Now, that's not particularly, I think if it hadn't been for the artificial human piece, it wouldn't be particularly noteworthy. Even having that line spoken by an artificial human itself isn't as noteworthy as the fact that Philip K. Dick's story and Hatcher and Peebles' screenplay make it believable that Batty would ask such a question. That was the key to making the story so powerful. As such, it became haunting because that fact seriously seems to undermine the idea of humanness. Does it even require having a human body? So can you see how this works now? Technology is the first major development that required the science fiction response from the storytelling instincts brought to life by Shelley and other brilliant artists. But I haven't talked about the second development that was needed in order to produce sci-fi, duality. Okay, it should be obvious at this point that science fiction is clearly a Western phenomenon, at least in origins. It has naturally since spread there to all corners of the globe. But then again, given that technology itself is required in order to pose the threats to our human essence, it makes sense that there is really no need for it in, say, foraging societies. I'll get to more of this in a minute. But for now, I want to point out that there was another development during the time frame we're discussing that was not technological but philosophical. It was a gradual change in overall worldview that went unspoken, changing slowly but affecting practically everything else, including our understanding of ourselves and the world. It's a perspective that began with Galileo, who, in his early conceptualization of physics, developed an approach to the world that would profoundly influence Western thought for centuries. Galileo was basically the founder of Western science, and his formulation of how we should view the world in order to carry out that science was incredibly influential. His view can really be summarized into four main principles. First, Galileo argued that empirical observation is the only criterion for truth. Okay, I can kind of see that. Second, only scientific methods and discourse are appropriate to the world of things. Now, there's a little bit of haze there, and what do you mean by things there, Big G? Anyway, third is that only mathematical properties of things are primary. Okay, so in other words, the mass and the velocity and the rotational inertia and all that stuff. Other qualities, he argued, are secondary and subjective. Okay. Now, finally, this, and I think most important for this analysis, is that the experience that we see from receive from our senses is, in his view, illusory. All of this, of course, sounds fairly reasonable, particularly since Galileo was primarily concerned with planetary motion and the motions of, say, rocks rolling down inclines and things like that. Now, being a psychiatrist, of course, I'm already asking, okay, what do you mean by things? I mean, we study minds, and this breaks down when you start thinking about that as your field of study. But Galileo wasn't concerned about that. Now, from these seemingly innocuous principles, the whole edifice of scientific and philosophical thought was laid out, and it underwent intense elaboration. After Galileo, for example, we saw the logical development of René Descartes, who erected an eternal barrier between the world of objects out there and the world of thoughts in here. Without getting too lost in the weeds here, you can oversimplify the huge amount of this philosophical discourse on this into the result that followed from it all, which is advocating for a dualistic view of the universe. On one hand, you have a world of objects, which operate by way of mechanistic, mathematical, and basically mindless rules. And then the world of subjective experience, which only happens in your head, is separated irrevocably from the world, and is therefore highly suspect. It's difficult to underestimate how pervasive this worldview has become, right on down to the everyday persons on the street. So now, what does any of this stuff have to do with science fiction? I think everything. This duality influenced all the great Enlightenment thinkers, religious and otherwise, and worked its way into the everyday person's thought as well, to this very day. When people say, oh, your symptoms are just in your head, or when internet edgelords and keyboard warriors fling comments from the peanut gallery that everything is all subjective. These and rather ill-formed opinions are not entirely to be blamed on their utterers, because these kinds of obnoxious opinions are simply logical conclusions of the ontology set up by Galileo and elaborated on to their logical conclusion by Descartes and Kant and Hume and all those, and a whole host of other thinkers. It is just that the common colloquial invocation of them usually lacks any nuance whatsoever that was, of course, present in the philosophers' original discussions. But this dualistic worldview has not gone unchallenged. Not only is it quite different from many much more ancient worldviews, such as that of Hinduism or Taoism or Neoplatonism, it has also encountered some serious challenges within philosophy itself, starting in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. Starting the beginning of this last century, we've seen many thinkers, particularly from phenomenology and philosophy of mind, to begin to question this dualistic way of looking at the world. That could be a whole video in itself, but what is important here is that the dualistic worldview, which sees the universe as a massive clockwork machine devoid of soul and spirit, populated sparsely with subjective monads floating around with representations in their head, is precisely the sort of hellscape that encouraged nightmarish horror and, for our purposes, science fiction responses. God, the gods, or the divine, however you see it, is flown so far into the highest and most abstract transcendent position, or is denied completely, that he, she, it, and or they are essentially argued out of any sort of relevance and oftentimes argued out of existence. In such a worldview, we are utterly alone, and that makes our human heart scream in horror. Hence, sci-fi often has a very strong religious undertone to it, but not in the sense of expressing a particular religion, but more often in expressing the desperate horror of a universe in which hardly any sort of overarching spirit exists. This existential horror then becomes the bread and butter in science fiction, even if it's only a disturbing undercurrent. Nevertheless, it is definitely front and center of the Frankenstein question. And you can see this in 2001, Brave New World, 1984, Dune, and of course, the beginnings of this you see in Frankenstein. For in that instance, the titular mad scientist is arrogating for himself that which was previously only thought to be within the province of the Almighty. When science seemed to discover that creation wasn't apparently in the sole hands of the Almighty, given the worldview discussed previously, it seemed that God had disappeared even further into abstraction. In that era, of course, most people wouldn't go quite so far as to say there were no God at all. Nevertheless, the Cartesian universe is essentially a godless one. God becomes something that only exists in your head. Atheism, nihilism, reductionism, and all therefore play heavy roles in pondering the horror and the anxiety that underlies the question, what does it mean to be human? Now that all this stuff is going on. So with each new technology, we no longer had to accept some of the limitations that we once did. This seems like a great thing. And sometimes it is. Like, hey, I don't have to accept a roughly 50% infant mortality that you see in some hunter-gatherer societies. But the unconscious never looks at things like the ego does. Nothing in the unconscious is all good or all bad. Nothing is taken for granted as a complete win with no problems. The unconscious imagines, explores, it asks, well, okay, what does this mean now? And the answers that it produces are images and symbols and stories. And with each new progression of the dualistic worldview, we saw more and more existential horror creeping into our stories. A world full of demons, spirits, and ghosts might seem itself like a hellscape, but funny enough, it doesn't seem to compare at all to a world in which the universe is almost completely empty of anything except mindless chunks of dead matter, with each of us trapped in an illusionary world of representations and suspicious projections. Such a worldview, combined with unstoppable technological innovations, practically forces the unconscious to endlessly produce stories that tackle the Frankenstein question. Contrast these causes of the Frankenstein question and all of its science fiction companions with a worldview that is actually much older and much more universal in the history of cultures. A typical indigenous worldview, for example, is that of animism, which is a kind of pantheism. And in such a worldview, everything is infused with spirit. Another example would be the medieval alchemists, where they argue it's not so much that we are bodies that happen to have souls, but rather we are bodies that exist within souls. In all non-dualistic worldviews, thoughts, feelings, and intentions don't just exist within human skulls, but within animals, plants, rocks, trees, the sun, the moon. Spirituality in a world like that is much easier because it exists in stuff that you can see right in front of you. There's no existential dread because we're never alone. We don't grapple with the idea that everything I see is an illusion because the spirit exists within everything that we see. Death even loses some of its sting too, because it still occupies, though it still occupies much of our unconscious storytelling labor. The 1,000-foot iron wall between subject and object, however, is simply not there. And we all find ourselves not as Cartesian monads floating in a lifeless clockwork void, but rather densely interconnected with everything and everyone around us. And now this view is not just one of indigenous tribes or hunter-gatherers, however. It is also a philosophical worldview that has become more popular, probably as a reaction to the previous dualistic one. In the works of phenomenologists, as well as more recent philosophers of mind, who defend the ideas of panpsychism, such as David Chalmers, Philip Goff, Bernard d'Espinat, and many others, I myself have weighed in on this matter when I published a paper in 2021 in the journal Synthes. It's a philosophy journal where I defend the idea of cosmopsychism, starting from basic problems in the philosophy of mind, I show how many of them resolve when we consider that the universe itself has a kind of consciousness, and we have it because we are a part of it. I'll put a link to the description there on that one. Many classic problems in the philosophy of mind become more manageable when we dismiss the dualism that developed after Galileo and return to a more ancient worldview of interconnectedness. Now, one could easily argue that this is just wishful thinking, and of course, that is what many internet cringe lords love to do. But just because a logically defended worldview is less horrifying does not mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean it's right either. In fact, I feel like the people who advocate for the isolated minds floating in the void view sometimes do it mainly just to be contrarian and to appear edgy and tough, rather than because it's actually more internally coherent than the non-dualistic ones. The fact of the matter is the non-dualistic ones are more coherent. That's why I defend it. And the fact that it is also more comforting, well, that's just icing on the cake. Anyway, that's my take on the origins and the essence of science fiction as a subgenre of fantasy. It started with the Frankenstein question, and it has been endlessly elaborated on since. And my question for you, do you like these kinds of deeper dives? Do you want more content like this? Because, like I said, it's time-consuming, and I have a day job. Nevertheless, if I get views and likes and subscribes and all that sort of thing, I'll be happy to create more stuff like this. Just let me know. And one thing you can do to show your engagement is chime in on the conversation. Do you agree with me and my Frankenstein question? And if not, why? What do you think the essential features of science fiction are? What do you think differentiates it from fantasy or horror? And as always, don't forget to pick up a copy of my fantasy novel, King of the Forgotten Darkness, Book 1 of the Raven's Tale series. And please subscribe to get all my video shorts, and I'll keep you posted on updates of my progress on Book 2 and everything else that's going on in my head. Later, gang.